In 1942, the U.S. Navy moored an aircraft carrier at Navy Pier in Chicago. Every morning, it left the pier, steamed out onto the lake, and spent the day recovering warplanes on its flight deck. The ship was the USS Wolverine, a gutted Great Lakes luxury steamer fitted with a 550-foot oak plank flight deck, and by most counts, this was the strangest vessel in the Navy's inventory. Yet, by 1943, a second similar carrier joined her patrols of Lake Michigan. Together, they would qualify nearly 18,000 naval aviators for Pacific combat operations without ever leaving the Great Lakes. So, how did these aircraft carriers end up in the lake? Why did Chicago need them? And what happened to them after the war ended? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the fascinating history of the Cornbelt Fleet. I'm your host, Ryan Sokesh, and you're watching It's History. Chicago's relationship with the military began at the water's edge. In 1803, Captain John Whistler arrived at the mouth of the Chicago River with orders from the Secretary of War, Henry Dearborn, to construct a frontier fort. The location was deliberate, as the Treaty of Greenville had ceded 6 square miles at the river's mouth to the U.S. specifically for military installations, recognizing its strategic value as the gateway between the Great Lakes and the interior of the continent. And that location would indeed have a turbulent timeline. It was destroyed in the War of 1812, rebuilt in 1816, and then decommissioned in 1837. By then, Chicago had outgrown it. Though the military presence there, it didn't leave. It simply evolved. In 1911, the Navy opened their Great Lakes Naval Training Station on Lake Michigan's shoreline at Lake Bluff. Designed initially to train just 1,500 sailors at a time, by the end of World War I, approximately 125,000 sailors had passed through its gates. With that in mind, the station's aviation component eventually outgrew the facility. So in 1937, the Navy established a Naval Reserve Air Base in Glenville, 14 miles northwest of Chicago's lakefront. Meanwhile, the city had also opened Municipal Pier No. 2 on the Chicago waterfront, a structure originally meant to serve trade and passenger traffic. Yet within just a few years of its construction, when the U.S. entered the First World War, the pier became a military barracks and recruitment center, training nearly 4,000 naval officers in the process before the war's end, which is why the city renamed it Navy Pier in their honor. So by the late 1930s, Chicago already had a massive naval airbase in its suburbs, a training station on its lakefront, and a pier with a decade-long history of military use. The infrastructure was in place. The Navy just needed ships and perhaps a catalyst. For better or worse, both things would arrive. After Pearl Harbor, the Navy faced an immediate crisis. Every fleet and light carrier was needed in the Pacific. Furthermore, training new pilots in carrier operations was impossible when the ships themselves were in combat. So in 1942, a Navy commander named Richard Whitehead proposed a radical solution. Why not just train the pilots on the Great Lakes, where ships could operate without fear of enemy submarines or aircraft, and where plenty of inland sea room allowed for safe takeoffs and landings? This idea of an aircraft carrier in the middle of Lake Michigan was unconventional, but the need was so urgent that the Navy approved, with the obvious question being, how could the Navy even get a combat carrier into the lake? The answer here is that they couldn't. For context, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which today connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes through a series of locks and channels, didn't even exist back in 1942. So without it, the lakes were effectively sealed off from the ocean. Not to mention, a fleet carrier measuring over 800 feet in length drew too much draft for shallow water connections regardless. Even the smaller escort carriers would have never made that transit. And so the Navy had no choice but to work with whatever ships were already inside the lake. And the only vessels large enough, stable enough, and immediately available were those old passenger steamers of the Great Lake excursion trade, and they were available in abundance. You see, steam navigation on the lakes dates all the way back to the early 19th century. By 1900, roughly 30 passenger liners operated across the 5 lakes, connecting industrial cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, or even as far away as Cleveland and Buffalo. Importantly, many of these routes combined freight with overnight passenger services, so the ships themselves were huge, and the experience was luxurious. Travelers boarded in the evening, dined in formal dining halls, slept in private staterooms, and arrived at their destination by morning, refreshed or perhaps in some cases hungover. It's hard to imagine now, but for the emerging American middle class, a Great Lakes overnight steamer was the closest domestic equivalent to a transatlantic crossing. And I want to reemphasize that the peak of the era produced ships of remarkable scale. For example, the SS Greater Buffalo and her sister ship, the SS Greater Detroit, both launched in 1923 by the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, were the largest sidewheel passenger steamers ever built and could carry over 2,000 passengers each. Naval architect Frank Kirby designed them at a cost of $3.5 million per vessel. That's roughly $49 million today. The Greater Detroit earned the nickname Leviathan of the Great Lakes. The Greater Buffalo was called the Majestic of the Great Lakes. Their stateroom count, 625 on the Greater Detroit alone, exceeded many ocean-going liners of the period. But there were also some smaller ships, such as the C&B, which was older but no less celebrated. Built in 1912 for the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company, she was 500 feet long, carried 1,500 passengers across 4 decks, and featured an elegant ballroom. She was the only passenger liner with 4 smokestacks ever built for Great Lakes service. In her prime, for just $49.50, passengers could book a 7-day, 2,230-mile cruise from Chicago to Cleveland or Buffalo and then back. But as glamorous as this all might sound, the downfall for that industry came fast as the Great Depression ended the era. In succession, the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company lost more than $2.8 million between 1930 and 1935. Additionally, automobile ownership redirected leisure travel to the open road as railroads pulled passengers away from the overnight routes that could take them to places like Buffalo. So by the late 1930s, ships that had once sailed at capacity were either laid up, operating at a loss, or just sitting idle as floating hotels. Thus, when the Navy came calling in March of 1942 and offered $750,000 for the C&B, the deal was not a sacrifice, it was a lifeline to a dying industry. This ship was the logical choice. Built by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in 1912, she displaced 7,200 tons, measured 500 feet in length, was powered by her massive coal boilers, and had 2-side paddle wheels to perform stably in calm water. With that acquisition complete, in March of 1942, the Navy shipped her to the American Shipbuilding Facility in Buffalo, New York for conversion. On site, contractors stripped her of any passenger accommodations, installed a wooden flight deck, added a bridge island on the starboard side, and she was also fitted for things like arresting gear and outriggers for damaged aircraft. By August the 12th of that same year, the USS Wolverine was commissioned in a wartime ceremony closed to the public. She began her new assignment in January of 43, was stationed at Navy Pier, and assigned to the 9th Naval District Carrier Qualification Training Unit. The Greater Buffalo followed a similar path but arrived later. Also a Great Lakes excursion steamer built in 1913 by American Shipbuilding. She was 518 feet long, but more narrow than the Wolverine at just 58 feet across the beam. The Navy acquired her in May of 43, renamed her USS Sable, and converted her with a steel flight deck at the same Buffalo shipyard. She arrived at Navy Pier on May the 26th, 1943, and with that, the Cornbelt Fleet was complete and the mission began. From dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, the ships left their moorings at Navy Pier and steamed into the lake. Pilots from the Naval Air Station at Glenville flew their single-engine aircraft out to the ship to practice landing. Each pilot was required to complete a minimum of 8 takeoffs and landings before they could earn their career qualification. A single day on the Sable was relentless. For example, on May the 28th, 1944, the ship broke her own record by qualifying 59 pilots, with 498 landings executed in just 531 minutes. Surprisingly, these trainings ran year-round, even in the winter. That's right, even in 1945, when Chicago suffered the worst winter in 39 years, the carrier operated without interruption. Now, the ships themselves were a unique engineering solution to wartime demand. Each was essentially a mobile runway with no hangar deck, elevators, or defensive armament. And since damaged aircraft couldn't be stowed below, they were just simply parked on the open flight deck or repaired on the spot. Now, if the deck became full of disabled planes, and it occasionally did, the day's training operations ceased and the carrier returned to the pier. I should also point out that coal consumption for these vessels was staggering. At full speed training operations, each ship burned approximately 150 tons of coal during a 14-hour day. Yet the scheme worked. By the war's end, the two carriers had trained 17,820 pilots, with a supported 116,000 landings and fewer than 300 aircraft lost. Among those trained was a future president, George H.W. Bush, who completed his career qualifications aboard the Sable on August the 24th, 1943, at just 19 years old. At that time, he was the second youngest pilot in the U.S. Navy. As the war developed, the carrier's limitations became apparent during calm weather, a problem that the Navy had not expected. Basically, to generate sufficient wind for takeoffs and landings, heavily loaded combat aircraft needed what the Navy called wind over deck conditions. In contrast, these ships were powered by paddle wheels and coal-fired engines, meaning they could not move fast enough on their own to create those conditions. So when the lake was glassy and windless, flight operations simply stopped, sometimes for days. With that, pilots began to pile up waiting for their qualification. To rectify the situation, the Navy improvised. They had pilots qualify in older, lighter aircraft like the SNJ Texan Trainer, planes that aviators had not flown in months, just to keep the training schedule moving. And it was this type of improvisation that occasionally led to operational accidents. Sources state that 21 pilots died while attempting their carrier qualifications alone, with the lake ultimately taking down 150 to 250 aircraft, depending on the source. Though most pilots did make it back to the shore safely. These losses were absorbed without public scandal, in part because the training program remained classified and unfamiliar to Chicago residents, which is strange to consider. The city, the massive city, lived above an entire fleet of military operations, yet knew almost nothing about what was happening at their pier. And so, by the fall of 1945, with victory in the Pacific secured, the ships were promptly stricken from the Naval Register and sold for scrap. What remains today is fragmented memory at best. Chicago's Navy Pier became a recreation center, then a cultural and commercial hub, and most visitors know nothing of the aircraft carriers that once steamed away from its docks. And so the true remains of this story lay beneath Lake Michigan itself. The lake bed still holds the scattered wrecks of aircraft lost during training. Salvage operations in recent decades have raised a few of them, which are reported to have been restored for private collections and museums. And so that is why Chicago had two aircraft carriers. And I need to tell you guys, I'm from Chicago, which you might notice from my local patriotism. Sorry, this side. And I also worked at Navy Pier as a photographer back in the early 2000s. Yet I had no idea that any of this went on there. Let me know if you had the same experience, and I thank you for watching. Otherwise, as always, this is Ryan Socash signing off.